This activity largely focuses on the distinction between freshwater tributaries and saltwater main stem of the bay to determine which fish are going to be where. But again, you could expand on different ideas depending on the background of your students. Scientists at VIMS and elsewhere monitor fish populations by conducting surveys. So this is like our version of a fish census, and it shows us how many fishes are in the bay and where they're living. This slide introduces students to one of the methods that scientists use to study fish, and it's the focus of this activity that students are going to do. So we use something called a trawl net, and this slide shows you the different parts of a trawl, and there's also a link to a video that explains these different parts and how a trawl net works. So we use this gear to sample different areas of the bay to get a representative sample of fishes. So just like a census, again, you might go to different neighborhoods to count people to see how many are in the whole town or state. And that's what we do. Since it's impossible to count every single fish in the bay, we try to collect samples in certain habitats and learn what that tells us about the overall population. This lesson uses data from an actual trawl survey conducted by VIMS scientists, and I've included some additional images in this PowerPoint from some real survey catches to help demonstrate that the diversity of species and overall numbers of fish can vary widely depending on where survey samples are collected. So there are two main parts to this activity. In the first part, students will use mock data from this VIMS fisheries survey to study how the abundance of 5 common Chesapeake Bay fish species can vary among habitats around the bay. So the 5 species I selected for this lesson plan are the blue catfish, the bay anchovy, spot, striped bass, and summer flounder. So overall, these 5 fishes are examples of how different species not only play important ecological roles as key prey items, like the bay anchovy, or predators, like a striped bass or a summer flounder, but they're also important to humans as species that we either fish for, like commercially or recreationally. And the blue catfish has a particularly unique role as one that has a negative impact on the ecosystem as it is an invasive species. Striped bass in this lesson are represented by both adults and juveniles to show that many species occupy different habitats as young and adults depending on their life histories. So all of these concepts and ideas, invasive species, life history, etc., can be expanded on or omitted as time allows for a lesson, or again, based on students' prior knowledge. But all 5 of these fishes are very common to the bay. They're common to our survey that we conduct on a monthly basis. And hopefully they're recognizable to a lot of students as one that they might have caught fishing or even eaten at a restaurant. So that's why I'm focusing on these 5 fish. So this slide summarizes the general questions to be answered and sets the stage for the first part of the activity. So for this activity, students are divided into 5 groups, where each group processes a trawl sample from one of 5 survey sites, either in the main stem, the main portion of the bay, or in one of the tributaries. And because we are here in Virginia, it focuses on the Virginia portion of the bay. So students in their small groups will identify, count, and sort fishes in their sample, just as scientists do on a real trawl survey, and should be able to draw conclusions about the differences in their catch between these different sites. The map and the instructions are included in the lesson plan, as well as the handouts for students. This lesson plan includes 2 handouts for each part of the activity. So for part 1, students are first asked to answer these pre-survey questions on their handout before sorting their samples and counting the fish. So these questions really just ask students to think about where their sample is coming from. Is it mostly fresh or salt water? What kinds of fishes out of these 5 do you think you would find there? And again, that's based off of the introductory slides and the discussion that you do beforehand, before the activity. So these are just some images of what the manipulatives in the activity could look like. But each group will receive a net full of fish that's caught at their site. The different species can be represented by any variety of materials. On the left-hand side here, I have colored beads, or you could use cutout pictures of the fish that are included with the lesson, like on the right-hand side. These cutout fish are made available as slides, where each slide has the correct numbers and types of fish for each site. So if you were delivering this lesson virtually, you could present that slide to the students and they could use that to count up the different fish that they have. On the handout, the students will sort and count the fish in their sample in a table, like the one here on the left, and are then asked to create a bar graph of the abundance of each species at their site. So they're asked to answer questions, do a group counting and sorting exercise, and then do the graphing. Each group will then share with the class what species they observed and answer questions about the fish communities in the habitats at these locations. And these questions are pretty broad, asking what fish they caught at their site, which is the most abundant, least abundant. So again, trying to use those vocabulary words. And then how their site compares to other groups and other locations around the bay. So after part 1 of the activity, students will hopefully come away with the understanding that different fishes live in different habitats around the bay. And then next, students will be asked to brainstorm why populations might change over time. So teachers can remind students that the distribution and abundance of a certain species can change in response to many different things, including changing environmental conditions, changes in the availability of their food, or even in this case, fishing pressure. So during the second part of this activity, students will use the data that they just collected to estimate how many fish of a species are present in the bay that year. And this is what scientists call an index of abundance. This figure on this slide is an example of an index of abundance for summer flounder. So in the most general sense, it's an estimate of what the summer flounder population is doing on a year-to-year basis. So now that the students have completed a year's census of data, let's see how this year's data compares to past census years to see how the population is changing through time. Using a second handout, each group will now focus on one of the 5 species and determine the total number of fish caught in the whole survey for that year. So for example, this group is focusing on bay anchovies. So they will go around to the other small groups and record the number of anchovies collected at the other sites and then add those up. That total is then added to a line graph where students can consider whether their population has increased, decreased, or stayed about the same. Since these data are based on a real-world survey, the exact numbers of fish are different, but the population trends in this lesson do mirror what's going on with these specific species in the wild, and the line graph will look different for each of the species and on each of the group's handouts. Each group is going to be asked to answer 2 questions on their handout after this second part of the activity. The first is the same for all groups, which just asks how their species' unique population has changed. And again, because fish species respond differently to changes in the environment or to fishing pressure, each group will answer a second question that is species specific. And these 2 final slides outline those questions for discussion as a class. So for the bay anchovy and spot, these 2 fishes, the population stays about the same. They're both very prevalent in the bay, and they're really important prey species for other fish. For blue catfish, this is an invasive species and the population is increasing. So there's a lot to talk about in there, whether that's a good or a bad thing. And then for striped bass and summer flounder, their populations are typically decreasing, which again, could have a lot to talk about with whether there's enough fish to fish from in the future. So that is what I have for this evening. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you consider using this lesson plan in your classroom. Again, in the VIMS catalog online with the other Virginia Sea lessons, you can find this lesson plan, this PowerPoint that I went through, and an appendix that includes the cutouts of the images if you prefer to use those for the activity. So thank you again, and I am happy to take any questions, or my email address is here on the slide if you'd like to reach out with any questions in the future. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Rachel. That was really informative. It does look like we've got a few questions here in the chat. So the first one is, how does the health of fish populations relate to humans?
Yeah, great question. So just like how human populations can go up or down, especially if you're looking at like a state or a county, it's the same thing with fishes. And if the fish population is going down over time, that could tell us that there's something going on in the wider ecosystem that is having a negative effect. So maybe there's more disease that's impacting these fish, or the temperatures are warmer, so they're not getting a lot of food. So it's a complicated picture, but a lot could be going on in the bay. And by sampling these populations, it tells us kind of what's going on.
Thank you for that. And then another question we had was, how long have scientists been recording fish populations?
Yeah, another great question. So this survey that is run by VIMS in particular has been running since the mid to late 1950s, which is one of the longest running fishery surveys in the country. So it is a wealth of data and information that we have that we can really have a long-term view of these fish populations.
And so as part of that survey, what kind of trends have you been seeing over time?
Yeah, it really depends on the species, just like I try to incorporate in the lesson plan. Some are really up and down, but even though there's a little variations, you can see if there's one that's going up over time or down. But what's interesting is with climate change, what we're finding is the fishes that are more common in this area, their abundances might be decreasing, and we're seeing more like tropical or warm water fishes. We're seeing their populations increase. So we can see those trends over time too.
And so does that, I mean, I think that would mean that we can directly connect that to climate change and warmer temperatures overall. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what kind of warm water fish species are we seeing more of in the Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah, you might see some that are more common around the Carolinas. So some examples are like a pinfish or a pigfish, not quite at like the Caribbean type of fishes, but definitely ones that are typically found in more southern waters.
And how long have they been showing up more here? Has it been like decades or just in the past few years?
Typically, you'll always get a few individuals every year, but they've been showing up in greater numbers, I would say, in the past 5 to 10 years. So it's definitely more recent.
Interesting. Well, yes, we've definitely seen extreme weather happening more and more over the last 5 to 10 years as well. Are there any other things that you've seen while you're doing your PhD that you think is important to know about the Chesapeake Bay watershed and how things are changing that you'd like to share?
I think one thing to keep in mind is that this ecosystem is very interconnected. So what's going on in the water with your fish and other marine organisms is very connected to what's going on the land. So when you think about pollutant runoffs and contaminants, as well as things like climate change and warming temperature, everything has kind of a domino effect. So it's always good to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I guess, for kind of everyday people in Virginia that live close to the coast or in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, what would you say are things that they can do in their own lives to help, make that less of a problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. For folks who live here in Virginia, always remember that even if you don't live directly on the coast, the watershed of area that drains into the bay is much larger. So you always want to be mindful of what types of things you put on your lawn or what you put down your drains that could end up in the bay and have a big impact on fish habitats. So even for fishes who don't live here in the bay year round, it's an incredibly important habitat for fish all up and down the Atlantic coast. So if we can protect those habitats, then we can help protect those fish.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel. I think that this has been a really informative lesson plan that you've provided to people that they can use in their classrooms throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And we really appreciate you taking the time to be here today and share that. I'll just quickly say for everybody that has tuned in, thank you for joining us. This recording will be available to you either on social media or via email. We'll be sending that out to everyone who signed up. And then our next webinar will be on February 7th at the same time, and it'll be on resource management of clams and oysters. So, yep, we're excited to keep talking about ways that you can teach about Chesapeake Bay watershed issues in your classrooms. So thank you so much, Rachel and the Virginia Sea Program and the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Fund for your support of this. And I hope that you all have a great evening.
Thank you so much.